I almost pass out from morning sickness, but my husband locks me in a shed in the cold of winter. Toughen up, LOL. I woke up in a hospital room, and my husband was laying next to me with serious injuries. "Don't you fricking dare act like you're sick, bitch!" My husband grabbed me by the arm, dragged me out the front door into the cold, dark world, forcefully shoved me into the storage shed out in the backyard and shouted, "You're a pregnant woman, and you're going to be a fricking a mother. You better stay here until you find the courage to be fricking harder on yourself, because I'm not going to let my son be raised by goddamn weakling." He forcefully slammed the door shut. I was locked in a hardly sheltering shed in the blistering cold of a snowy night in mid-January. Just before I fainted from the cold, I clutched my stomach with both of my hands, trying everything I could to stay awake. But oblivion settled in, and I quickly lost consciousness. I woke up the next day to discover myself in a hospital bed. In the bed next to me lay my wounded husband, with a bunch of bandages wrapped around his forehead. What the hell had happened? This is the story of how a physically abusive husband took things way too far, and how I had help from many people to firstly get myself out of trouble, and second, to get him the brutal justice he deserved. My name is Valerie, and I'm a 26-year-old housewife. After graduating from college, I started working for a company, but when I married my husband, David, I left the company and became a housewife per his request. I met David in my senior year in college, and we were taking the same classes and became good friends. As our study sessions together grew more and more frequent because of the heavy load of assignments and exams that stood before us, seeing him work so hard towards his goal of eventually starting his own business while maintaining a very gentle, gregarious personality gradually made me infatuated in him. Unfortunately, we was already in another relationship, so I knew I shouldn't interfere. That's why I was so shocked to hear him confess his feelings for me one afternoon. He'd actually broken up with his girlfriend of 8 months because he wanted to be with me. I was so happy, and after 2 years of being together, we got married 2 years ago. Needless to say, the marriage was great for a while. Just last year, we bought our own house and were excited about our new life together. Next month was February, and it was our wedding anniversary. We went to the store to reserve a cake, but I was surprised when I opened the door. The savory smell that usually sent my heart aflutter with the thought of soft cake with whipped cream and strawberries instead made me want to gag. I couldn't even look at the cakes on display and told David, "I'm sorry, can I ask you to pick out my favorite one and reserve it for me? I'm not feeling very well for some reason." And he replied with a sigh, "Oh, come on, you said you wanted to come here, Val." "But I just don't feel so good." And then he glared at me maliciously and replied strongly, "Well then, looks like we don't have any business here." With that, he left the cake shop. After that, he kept walking in complete silence. I mustered up the courage to tell him something. "I'd like to take a short rest, honey." I told him that I wanted to take a break. Then he sighed loudly again. "Why don't you go rest on your damn own then?" With that, he walked away and left me right where I stood in shocked silence. I sat down on the bench and did some thinking. If this were the case when we were dating, he would have been worried sick about me. But I suppose that was what is known as marital habituation, known as the phenomenon couples experience when they get used to each other's presence a little too much. But if he was treating me like this now, I began to wonder what would happen in 10 years, 20 years, and beyond. With these fears in my mind, I waited for my sudden ailment to improve before standing up and walking back home. After that day, I continued to feel rather under the weather, as nausea and vomiting became more and more prominent, and I began to think about going to the hospital if this kept up any longer than a few more days. To make matters worse, David started to become a little harsh towards me. Whenever he saw me struggling to stand or rush into the bathroom, he often took out his frustration. One day in particular, as I was lying on the sofa, the living room door opened with a bang, and David walked in with an expression of abhorrence on his face. "Hurry up and make me dinner, damn it." "I'm sorry, honey. I'm not feeling too well." "What, this again? You've been slacking on your chores lately because of the same damn excuse. What's wrong? Got food poisoning from your own cooking or some shit like that?" "I'm not slacking off on the chores." Need I remind you that I'm work in an office? You're a woman. It's your damn job to take care of the whole house. This is where you belong, and doing all the housework is a damn lot easier than my fricking job. You can't even do something as simple as making your husband dinner, eh? Why must you say such nasty things? His disparaging words toward women made me lose my temper, and I strongly retorted to him. Perhaps he didn't like what I said or did. He kneeled before me, grabbed my hair, and said menacingly as he glared directly into my eyes, "And in what universe are you allowed to talk back to me, bitch? Whose money do you think you live on, eh?" I winced in pain. I laid my hand on the hand that was pulling at my scalp. "Okay, David. I'm sorry. Please forgive me." I felt so bad that I didn't have any energy left to argue with him. My husband's voice echoed in my head, causing a splitting headache. I brought my index finger to my mouth and gestured for him to be quiet. Then he let loose a tsk and walked out of the living room shouting, "I thought you would be a better wife than this, Val. I'm disappointed you turned out to be such a sloppy piece of trash." I didn't think he was the kind of person who would lash out in such manner. Wasn't he at least supposed to be there for me for moral and physical support when I was having a really hard time? Soon after, I heard the front door slam, and I came to the conclusion that my husband went out for dinner that night. I was too angry and sick to handle it alone, so I sent a message to a young neighbor next door named Pauline. She was another newlywed of the same age, and we've been having a lot of small talk ever since we bought the house. More recently, it was not uncommon for me to talk to her about David and his malicious demeanor at home. "Hey, Pauline. So my husband got mad at me again." When I sent that message, she immediately replied, "Are you okay? Or rather, are you still sick? I'll bring you some things now. Thank you. Yay." A few minutes later, the doorbell rang. I struggled to my feet and unlocked the door to find a smiling Pauline with her hands full of mandarin oranges. "You have to eat a lot, especially when you're sick, sweetie." "Oh no, don't you dare. They're heavy. I'll carry them." "Excuse me." Wow, so many. Thank you so much, Pauline. This means a whole lot. We ate quite a few oranges together as we got to talking about my husband, among other things. "I really can't thank you enough, honey. I'm feeling so much better now." "Good. I'm so glad. If you ever need anything else, just let me know. I'm always here for me." Even when David said terrible things to me and hurt me, I always had her as someone to listen to me, and our little talks always gave me the energy to do what I could again. When she left, I felt very grateful and relieved, and seeing as it was approaching 7 p.m., I thought a good long sleep at night would also help me with the nausea. So I got into my PJs, brushed my teeth, went upstairs to my room, and fell asleep as soon as my head hit the pillow. A few hours later, I felt myself being shaken very vigorously, and I woke up with a start. "Wake the frick up, bitch!" I slowly opened my eyes, and there knelt David, his face blood red with fury. I involuntarily gasped as he looked at me as though I was nothing but a piece of filth. "You good-for-nothing little incompetent whore. I've done you the trouble of leaving you alone in the house to improve things around here, but nothing has changed, has it? Don't you dare fricking slack off anymore. If I catch you resting when you shouldn't be, so help me, I'll—" He grabbed my collar and pulled forcefully, causing me to slide across the bed, nearly falling off the edge onto my back. Suddenly it felt a massive jolt run through my entire body, and with it came an overwhelming tsunami of nausea. I sprinted into the bathroom and didn't bother closing the door behind me. David calmly strode over to the bathroom, leaning against the doorframe, crossed his arms, and eyed me coldly, from beginning to end. The next day, I finally went to the hospital and found out a truly unexpected truth. "Congratulations, you are pregnant." "What? Pregnant?" I double-checked with my doctor, and she said I was in my 6th week of pregnancy. According to the initial evidence, everything regarding the baby seemed to be fine. As it turned out, the ailment I'd been battling every day was none other than morning sickness. I went home with a feeling of joy that I couldn't put into words, but I was worried about one thing. I wondered if my husband would be pleased with these news. When my husband came home from work that evening, I immediately told him about it all. "David, honey, I went to the hospital today because, well, You know, I've been feeling pretty nauseous lately and vomiting. Well, it was going on for quite a while, and I was thinking a checkup would be good, and well, I actually have some amazing news. I found out that I'm pregnant. Wait, what? He just stared at me with a blank expression on his face, and I took it as something good. He looked so funny because his face was as though he had no idea what I was talking about, lol. But then he proceeded to say the most ridiculous thing he could have said in that moment. It's a boy, isn't it? What? We don't know the sex yet. I don't want a fricking child if it's not a boy. I was aghast. How dare you say that? It doesn't matter what sex it is. David then raised his own eyebrows and cocked his head as though I was the crazy person in the room. What are you talking about? I don't need a woman to be my heir for the business. A man who goes out to work, make good money, and brings it home to his family is leaps and bounds better than a woman who doesn't do any of those things. A daughter won't bring us any happiness. It'll only bring a meaningless existence on which I'd have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars. For what? For a bitch who's going to marry a man and stay at home her whole life? No, I'm not having any damn daughter over my dead fricking body. I couldn't find the words to reply to all the comments that didn't make any goddamn sense. I had no idea that the man I married felt in this way about sex roles and children. In that moment, I was so angry that my body shook. I thought to myself, if he ever says anything that hurts my child, I will definitely divorce him. The next day, I reported to Pauline about the pregnancy and David's attitude when I told him the news. Congratulations! Thank you. But still, about your husband, that's just terrible. I know I would be devastated if my own husband said something like that. David just seems like a very respectable man, Val, and to know he has these messed up ideologies is a huge deal breaker in my book. I actually thought about using you as an example against his stupid stereotypes, but I figured that would be the worst thing to do. He would call you all sorts of nasty things behind your back, no less, and it would make things for you and for me very awkward. I didn't really argue with him, mostly because it's just so messed up I couldn't believe he was straight up saying such bullshit. But I've made up my mind to divorce him if anything happens to the child. I see. Well then, I think you should keep a diary. If you write down what happened every day, adding in some details of what David did to you or said to you, it'll be useful as evidence in case of emergency. I see. I understand. That's a genius idea, Pauline. I thus took her advice and started keeping a diary starting that day. I kept the details in the entries as accurately and meticulously as possible, so that in the event I ever had to resort to legal measures to get divorced, it would go in my favor. A few weeks passed and my morning sickness was at its peak. I couldn't even drink a whole glass of water, let alone eat anything solid. Late one night on a cold Saturday, I had just gone through a routine vomiting session and I was drained of my energy. I stumbled out of the bathroom and fell to the floor. As gravity did what it did best, I slammed my arm against the door and a dull thud that echoed throughout the entire house, and a wave of pain spread around my entire upper body. I knew my arm wasn't broken or anything like that, but I actually felt a little grateful for that wave of agony, as it woke me up pretty much completely from my intermittent momentary visits to the unconscious realm. Oof, that was a bad analogy. My point is that I was shifting in and out of consciousness at that moment, and me falling against the door brought me to full consciousness. Ouch! I cowered on the spot, clutching my arm. Perhaps David heard the sound and felt the vibrations of my fall, for came out of his bedroom and said to me as I cowered, "Will you shut the frick up? You woke me up, damn it! Don't you fricking dare act like you're sick, bitch!" I'm not pretending, honey. As the pain subsided, my initial state of shifting in and out of consciousness resumed, and I found myself in a foggy state. My own condition was all I could think about, and whatever David did or said to me became something I couldn't care less about. He pulled on my clothes with such force, and he didn't even bother to put on his shoes as he switched to grabbing my arm, dragged me out the front door into the cold, dark world, threw me out into the backyard. While I was lying there in the cold, struggling to stand, I noticed a white substance had accumulated on what should have soft green grass. It felt cold to the touch. Excruciatingly cold. So cold it actually burned. I felt the same substance on top of my head, and as I looked up, I felt this substance fall upon my face. As I could hear David retreat into the house, looking for something, I swayed in the slight breeze. It was snowing peacefully outside, but that serenity was about to be met with a few hours of dangerous action. After finding something in the house, David stormed back outside and marched to me. "Come here! Ow! David, please! Stop this!" He grabbed me by the hair and started walking towards a shape in the darkness. The barely discernible outline reminded me of the old storage shed we had in the yard, and the next thing I knew, David was forcefully shoving me into it. He grabbed my clothes, my arms, my legs, my face, my hair, all the while saying to me, "You're a pregnant woman, and you're going to be a fricking mother. You better stay here until you find the courage to be fricking harder on yourself, because I'm not going to let my son be raised by goddamn weakling." With a final huff, he actually picked me up and literally thrust me to the ground of the shed before he closed the door. The impact sent my head backward, and I struck something that felt like car tires. A surge of pain swept across my head, neck, and shoulders, and my vision went blurry. In fading consciousness, I realized what he had retrieved from the house. It was a padlock. I was locked in a hardly sheltering shed in the blistering cold of a snowy night in mid-January. "Open up, please." With all the remaining strength I had, I tried to open the door, but it didn't budge. I was so cold my fingers and toes were starting to go numb, and my mind was going black. Just before I fainted, I clutched my stomach with both of my hands, trying everything I could to stay awake. But oblivion settled in, and I quickly lost consciousness. Only God knows how much time passed before I heard the faint sound of someone screaming at me. I heard a voice, but it doesn't sound like David's. It sounded deeper and higher. Why would... Who? Help me. But I was in no state to speak. I lost consciousness again. When I woke up the next day, the first thing I saw was a white, checkered ceiling. I only moved my eyes as I looked at my surroundings, and I realized that I was in a hospital room. The hands of the clock were pointing to 8 o'clock in the morning. I noticed a humanoid shape lying on the bed next to mine, and I risked a twist of the head, which, surprisingly enough, didn't hurt me as much as I thought it would. But I was even more surprised to see who the patient in the next bed was. It was none other than David, my own wounded husband, with a bunch of bandages wrapped around his forehead. He was still out cold, it seemed. His breathing was deep, and his eyes were closed tight. What the hell had happened last night? Just as I was thinking this, the door to the hospital room opened and Pauline walked in. No sooner had she seen me than her eyes widened and she rushed to me. "Valerie, you're awake. Are you okay?" "Hi, Pauline. I feel just so." I noticed my nausea was still there, albeit somewhat weakened. "What are you doing here, sweetie?" "Ah, right. You were already unconscious during the commotion. I'm only sorry I had reported to the police earlier." "I'm sorry." Then she started telling me about everything that had happened the night before. Around midnight was when she heard David's outburst, and out of fear for my safety, she called my in-laws. She actually went to my in-laws' farming class, where they grew things like tomatoes, corn, and even mandarin oranges, and she knew Mr. and Mrs. Simpson personally. They came right away, but then I could hear their voices, and from how they sounded I could only imagine they'd started arguing. "Where's Valerie?" Mr. Simpson shouted, and David answered, "I fricking locked her ass in the shed out back. I'm punishing her." When they heard where you were, they got even angrier and stormed out into the yard. That's when I saw David do something downright terrifying, and I immediately got scared and rushed to call the police and emergency services. Pauline explained with tears in her eyes. When she'd peeked over the garden wall, she saw David picking up a large stone that was just there and proceeded to attempt to strike his own father with it. A head-on blow from such a large stone would have definitely killed him. But Mr. Simpson had been pursuing his hobby of kickboxing for the better part of 30 years, and he quickly dodged David's lunge and, in a defensive fashion, fought back. The police arrived shortly after and brought the situation under control, and at about the same time, paramedics arrived and rushed my husband and I, who both had head injuries, according to the police, to emergency medical care. I was trapped in the warehouse, locked from the outside with a padlock, and they had break down the door with an electric saw to rescue me. I was so shocked about the truth of the events of the previous that I couldn't speak. It sounded like something straight out of a horror movie. Mr. and Mrs. Simpson are now being interviewed by the police. I'm also going to talk to them soon, as a key eyewitness. In response to my anxiety, Pauline continued, "I'm sorry I couldn't help you sooner, Val. First of all, you and the baby need to rest well. I think you can worry about the future slowly, bit by bit, after you get back to normal." She then left the hospital room, leaving the bushel of oranges she had grown in her farming class up on the shelf, just as she had done the day she came over. A nurse came a few seconds later. She informed me that doctors had diagnosed me with mild hypothermia and malnutrition, and I was going to need an IV. The baby suffered no injuries and was completely safe and sound. I cried and cried, partly from relief, partly from fear, and asked about David. She consoled me and told me he was sleeping off the effects of the anesthesia from the emergency surgery. Soon after their interview with the police was over, my parents-in-law came to see me. "We're very sorry, Valerie, dear. We've made such a huge mistake in our son's education." They got to their knees and asked for my forgiveness. Mr. Simpson had wounds on his hands from his fight with his son. I had inflicted a nasty wound on my own father-in-law because of me. I couldn't help but cry with guilt. "I'm sorry I caused you so much worry. Oh, Valerie, my dear, don't you dare. You've done nothing wrong." Then Mrs. Simpson paused for a moment and said, "I needed your insurance card, so I checked your bag while you were being taken to the hospital, and I found your diary. It was a record of my husband's verbal and physical abuse of me. And when my parents-in-law read it all, they fully realized what was going on with their son. Speak of the devil." Just then, David woke up at the sound of our voices, and all of a sudden he turned to me and said, "You fricking did this to me. You better apologize, or so help me." I was beyond furious at him. Who would say such a thing the very moment he awoke from his slumber? "Are you fricking serious?" Perhaps he was offended by my unusual retort. He turned up the heat and said, "Don't get cocky just because you got dad on your damn side. If you still want to be married to me, apologize to me now." A golden opportunity, I told him once and for all. "I don't want to be married to a piece of shit like you." He looked me in the eye and said, "What are you talking about? If I'm not there, what will happen to the child, eh? I'd rather not have a man like you, who doesn't know what it's like to be a father and who has such deranged views of women and children. At all," I shouted, and Mr. Simpson continued, as he stepped partway between David and I. "Yes, and you actually tried to kill me too. I can't have a dangerous child like that staying together with such a girl as Valerie. You're divorcing her. What the actual hell? So help me, ow, my head." David tried to stand up in anger, but the wound was definitely pretty serious, for he was writhing in agony, holding his head. The nurse who walked in just then took care of him, and he stayed quiet. A few days later, I was safely discharged from the hospital and returned to my own parents' home. The day before I left, Mrs. and Mr. Simpson came to my house with the divorce documents. The documents were already filled out on David's side, so all I had to do was fill them out and submit them. Mr. Simpson told me that I ought to ask for alimony, so I heeded his advice and demanded David a handsome amount. In addition, Pauline's testimony in this case led to David's arrest for deliberate injury to me and his father. The injuries Mr. Simpson inflicted on David were admitted as self-defense. His parents severed their ties with him after that, and vowed they would never let him step across the threshold of their home again. In the end, all that was left was the alimony payment, and he lost his parents, his family, everything. With his criminal record, he undoubtedly has a long and painful life ahead of him. But I don't feel sorry for him, not one bit. He brought all this on himself, and I don't care what happens to him anymore. And as for me, all I can do now is rest well and hope that the baby, who I now know is indeed a son, will be born safely. I'll be waiting for you, my darling. I'll be waiting for you. And I'm going to be the happiest woman in the world when I'll finally be able to hold you in my arms. I promise you. I'm going to shower you with all the love you deserve, and I'm going to make you grow up into a kind-hearted, responsible, trustworthy young man. I'll be waiting for you. I gently rubbed my belly as I spoke to my beloved child.